In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1997, Townes Van Zandt lay dying at home in Smyrna, Tennessee, frail alcoholic, yet characteristically stubborn to the end. Just days before, the 52-year-old troubadour had dragged himself to a recording session in a wheelchair with his hip shattered from a drunken fall. He was determined to record one last album, but his body was failing. That night, as friends tried to keep him conscious, his breathing stopped, and his official cause of death was natural cardiac arrhythmia. It was a tragic end, one that rather uncannily mirrored the fate of his idol, Hank Williams, who also died on a New Year's Day after a life of heartbreak and booze. Townes himself had never expected to grow old. "I don't envision a very long life for myself. I think my life will run out before my work does," he admitted years earlier. Indeed, his prophecy proved true, and the work he left behind, a songbook of fragile beauty and well-bottomed darkness, has only grown in stature since his passing. How did this enormously talented songwriter wind up suffering such a sorry and obscure end? Time to have a look at the life of Townes Van Zandt. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Townes Van Zandt's life really was the stuff of a folk ballad. A wealthy Texas son who rejected a life of privilege to roam the open road with a guitar. A poet who wrote devastating songs in dingy motel rooms. A performer as likely to leave an audience in tears as in laughter. He was revered by his peers as a songwriter's songwriter. Yet Townes spent much of his career in obscurity and was often playing for tiny crowds in dive bars and ramshackle venues. He battled mental illness and addiction that erased years of his life and memories. By the end, he had become a gaunt, weary figure, as much a ghost as a man. The ghost of Hank Williams, with a twist, in the words of singer Emmylou Harris, recalling her first sight of him on stage in the late 1960s. Townes Van Zandt was born into Texas aristocracy. He entered the world on March 7, 1944, in Fort Worth, Texas, the sign of an influential family. The Van Zandts had deep roots in the state's history. Townes was the great-great-great-grandson of Isaac Van Zandt, who was a major political figure in the Republic of Texas, and a great-great-grandnephew of Kleber Miller Van Zandt, a Confederate major and a co-founder of Fort Worth. His father, Harris Williams Van Zandt, was a corporate lawyer, and his mother, Dorothy Townes, a genteel Southern matriarch. The family's wealth and status meant that Townes' childhood wanted for little materially. Yet the young boy, who could have been groomed for country clubs and political office, was far more at home wandering the countryside with a guitar in hand. From early on, Townes clearly had a restless intellect and quite a rebellious streak in him. As a grade schooler, he tested with an extremely high IQ, and this led his parents to imagine a future for him as a lawyer or senator. They enrolled him in prestigious preparatory schools to tame his unruly energy, but these places seemingly could not contain him. The family also moved frequently for his father's career, from Fort Worth to Midland, then to Billings, Montana, and onward to Colorado and Illinois. By his teens, Townes had lived in a half-dozen places and was a perpetual new kid. Maybe this rootlessness sowed the seeds of the rambling life he would later choose. At 14, he watched Elvis Presley's seminal performance on The Ed Sullivan Show and was thunderstruck. "I just thought that Elvis had all the money in the world, all the Cadillacs and all the girls. And all he did was play the guitar and sing," he later said, calling that moment the starting point for his own musical obsession. That Christmas, 1956, his father gave him his first guitar, which quite unwittingly set his son's destiny in motion. Instead of studying law or commerce, Townes spent his high school days learning chords and folk songs, roaming the outdoors, and dreaming of a life in music. Beneath the musical dreams, however, darker currents were stirring. In his late teens, Van Zandt began experiencing bouts of depression and wild mood swings that would plague him for life. After seeing this, his parents intervened in drastic fashion. The breaking point came during Townes' college years at the University of Colorado Boulder. He had enrolled there in 1962, majoring in psychology and English, and by outward appearances was a gifted student who wrote poetry and devoured records by Lightning Hopkins and Hank Williams. But he was also binge drinking heavily and behaving erratically. In one incident, the young Van Zandt decided to jump from a fourth-floor dormitory balcony just to see what it would feel like. Miraculously, he survived the fall. This daredevil stunt alarmed his family and hinted at a self-destructive impulse that would resurface later. His parents flew to Boulder in the spring of 1964 and withdrew him from school, checking him into a psychiatric facility in Galveston, Texas. There, at just 20 years old, Townes was diagnosed with manic depression and subjected to an experimental treatment that would haunt him forever: insulin shock therapy. For 3 months, doctors repeatedly induced daily comas in the young man with massive insulin doses, a practice now discredited as barbaric. The treatment erased huge swaths of Townes' long-term memory. He later said he could recall almost nothing of his childhood after it. "My biggest regret in life was that I had allowed that treatment to occur," Townes' mother confessed years afterward. The experience left Townes emotionally raw, his mind part blank slate, part storm of chemical imbalance. It also won him a draft exemption from the military. An Air Force doctor who evaluated him labeled Van Zandt an acute manic depressive who has made minimal adjustments to life, and this rendered him unfit for service. In a strange irony, the horrors that threatened to destroy his life also spared him from being sent to Vietnam. I do hate to interrupt the story for housekeeping, but I'd like to mention that there is now a members area up and running here on YouTube, which you can access by clicking the join button below the video. I did announce this in a previous video, but apparently I didn't press some deeply hidden button in the mechanics of YouTube that is required to actually turn the memberships on. All I can say is that I am a bloody wally, as we might say in my neck of the woods. So, for those of you who asked about it, it is now finally available. And I can finally stop crying myself to sleep at night because no one signed up. If you do join, you get some amusing perks like custom emojis that you can use in comments, and badges next to your name that evolve over time until you make it all the way to the king himself. The higher tier will even get a monthly extra mini video by way of thanks on some obscure musical subject or other. Of course, this is certainly not obligatory, and it's really only for those who want to chip in and help me out. All the main videos will be here for free on YouTube for as long as I'm here to make them. And of course, leaving a like, a comment, sharing, or subscribing are incredibly helpful also. Cheers, let's get on with it. In 1965, having somewhat recovered from the hospital ordeal, Townes attempted to resume a normal trajectory. He enrolled in the University of Houston's pre-law program to appease his family. He even married his first girlfriend, a Houston elementary school teacher named Fran Peterson, that August, when he was 21. They would have a son named John Townes Van Zandt II, who they nicknamed JT in 1969. For a brief moment, Townes walked the straight path laid out for him, a young husband and future lawyer from a good family. But the darkness of fate and his own nature ended up pulling him elsewhere. The very next year, in 1966, Townes' father suddenly died of a heart attack at age 52. This loss shook Townes hard. Harris Van Zandt had been one of the few pillars of stability in Townes' tumultuous young life. After burying his father, the 22-year-old heir made a dramatic decision. He dropped out of college for good, left his wife, the marriage to Fran would officially end in divorce by 1970, and set out on the road with a guitar and a notebook. He had resolved to become a songwriter, come what may. The tidy life of a Houston attorney was out. The winding road of a troubadour lay ahead. With his inheritance and safety net largely left behind, Townes Van Zandt drifted into the bohemian folk scene of Texas in the mid-60s, determined to make a name for himself in music. He had few professional credits beyond some poems and homemade songs, but in the music clubs of Houston, he found a place for his talent. In 1965, he began playing regular gigs at a local spot called the Jester Lounge, earning $10 a night. It was rough baptism by fire training. Townes' early sets consisted mostly of cover songs. He loved songwriters like Bob Dylan and native bluesman Lightning Hopkins and learned their tunes, interspersed with a few goofy originals like a talking blues titled Fraternity Blues, poking fun at a college life. Audiences in smoky Texas bars were fickle, but the lanky young singer with the soulful eyes and locally famous surname was gradually getting noticed. Soon he had a growing repertoire of his own folk ballads and blues. Houston in the late 60s was a powerful nexus for folk, country and blues, and Townes soaked up every influence he could. Performing at folk coffee houses like the Sand Mountain and the Old Quarter, where he sometimes slept upstairs after the crowds left, he met fellow up-and-comers who would become lifelong friends. Among them was a young Guy Clark, a Texas songwriter with whom Townes struck up a close friendship. He also met Jerry Jeff Walker, a traveling folk singer, and even his idol, Lightning Hopkins, who schooled Townes in Texas blues guitar picking. Another night in a Houston club, Van Zandt encountered a fellow troubadour named Mickey Newbury, who was so impressed with Townes' raw talent that he urged him to try his luck in Nashville, and he told Townes he could set him up there. In 1968, Newbury made good on his promise. He brought 24-year-old Townes to Nashville and introduced him to cowboy Jack Clement, the maverick producer, known for his work with Johnny Cash and others. Clement saw potential in the soft-spoken Texan with the haunting songs and promptly signed on to produce Van Zandt's debut album. The Nashville recording sessions in 1968 yielded For the Sake of the Song, Townes Van Zandt's first album, released by Poppy Records. Townes' songs were now preserved on vinyl and ready for the world. The album featured early compositions like the title track, which was a yearning lament that would become something of an artistic manifesto for him. However, the album's production was lush and rather heavy on strings, decisions by Clement that Van Zandt later felt smothered his songs. It received a bit of attention, but in the country and folk music press, talk began to start up about this talented but troubled newcomer. Over the next few years, Townes was on an intensely prolific songwriting tear. Between 1968 and 1973, he released an astonishing 6 albums of original material. Our Mother the Mountain, a dark atmospheric collection that included the tragic ballad Tecumseh Valley, a self-titled album Townes Van Zandt, which revisited some of the early songs in starker arrangements, Delta Mama Blues, High, Low and In Between, and the late great Townes Van Zandt. This rapid-fire burst produced many of the songs that would later be acknowledged as masterpieces of American folk music. Among them were To Live Is to Fly, If I Needed You, and Pancho and Lefty, all written before Townes turned 30. Yet for all this output, mainstream success eluded Townes Van Zandt. His records sold poorly, and mainstream country radio completely ignored him. Instead, his music found an audience in the margins. College students, fellow musicians, and British and French folk fans began exchanging his albums like they were secret lost treasures. Chris Christopherson famously dubbed Van Zandt a songwriter's songwriter, and Chris was a huge admirer, even as he acknowledged that Townes hadn't gotten his due in the wider world. Those who caught Townes performing live during this era often found a magnetic but extremely mercurial man. On a good night, in a small club, he could hold a room in rapt silence with just his voice and guitar. His songs had a plaintive, almost painful beauty. As Emmylou Harris said, he had a, quote, high, lonesome sound in his voice that could cut straight to the heart. The material was often very bleak. Indeed, his very first fully realized song, 1968's Waiting Around to Die, was one of his darkest. Over a gentle picking pattern, he sang of abuse, addiction, prison, and the grim resignation of a man who finds it's easier than just waiting around to die. In the song's refrain, Van Zandt's voice rose to a ragged yodel on the word die, which might just send a few chills down your spine. You can't get much bluer than a Townes Van Zandt song, one writer observed, and Waiting Around to Die was the blueprint, a ballad drawn from real pain. On other nights, however, Townes' personal demons would sabotage his performances. He might stumble on stage drunk, forget his lyrics, or dissolve into rambling jokes to cover his nerves. Always shy and eccentric, he developed a trademark stage patter to lighten the mood between sad songs. I have a few that aren't sad, they're like hopeless, he would quip dryly if someone criticised the darkness and depressing nature of his repertoire. It was true, even his light songs often portrayed totally hopeless situations. Audiences weren't sure whether to laugh or cry, which was exactly how Van Zandt liked it. Sometimes I'll introduce one of my songs as a puker, he joked in one interview, meaning he could write tunes so depressing they'd make you sick. That gallows humour became an integral part of his persona. In the end, though, how can any song be depressing when it's as beautiful as a Townes Van Zandt composition, no matter the subject? Despite his self-deprecation, those songs were connecting powerfully with people, albeit slowly, one soul at a time. A remarkable scene captured in the documentary Heart-Worn Highways, filmed in 1975, illustrates the quiet impact of Van Zandt's music during this period. In the film, Townes is shown in his modest trailer home outside Austin, Texas, a cluttered, ramshackle place with no heat or plumbing, where he often lived in the 70s. It's daytime. Van Zandt casually pours himself a tumbler of whiskey and takes a seat in his kitchen with his guitar. His young wife at the time, Cindy, putters with chores and hums along. An elderly black man known as Uncle Seymour Washington, a neighbor and friend, sits down nearby to listen. Townes begins to sing Waiting Round to Die. Verse by verse, as the sorrowful story unfolds, the camera stays on Uncle Seymour's face. The old man's eyes well up. Silently, tears begin streaming down his cheeks. By the song's end, he is openly crying, moved in a way that words can't explain. It's an extraordinarily raw moment on film. One of Townes Van Zandt's saddest songs, reducing a hardened old cowboy to tears. The clip has since become famous, and it really shows how Townes' music could pierce straight to the heart. By the early 1970s, Van Zandt's reputation among musicians and serious listeners was sky high, even if mainstream fame still escaped his grasp. He was a traveller by nature, often disappearing from the circuit to take off on solitary adventures. He might spend a whole summer alone on horseback in the Colorado mountains, or hitchhike across the desert with just his guitar and a backpack of his own records to sell. In one instance, fellow Texan musician Joe Ely picked up a hitchhiker in 1971 near Lubbock, only to realize it was Townes, this tall, scarecrow-looking guy, carrying nothing but a bag of LPs of Our Mother the Mountain. Ely took him home to play the album for friends. Townes wrote many of his songs during these wanderings. He preferred seedy motel rooms and backwoods cabins as his creative spaces. Motel blinds that mimicked the night, as he put it, were conducive to summoning lyrics. He later claimed that his most famous composition, Pancho and Lefty, came to him through a motel window in Dallas one night. The song, which paints a brilliant portrait of a bandit's betrayal, felt almost channeled. I realised that I wrote it, but it's hard to take credit. It came from out of the blue, it came through me, Zandt said, describing the almost mystical inspiration behind Puncho and Lefty. Decades later, he was still trying to decipher its meaning. These comments fueled the long-standing myth of towns as a sort of medium for songs that flow from someplace beyond. Not every gamble in these years paid off. In 1972, Zandt recorded an album's worth of new songs under the working title 7come11. But a fight between his manager, Kevin Eggers, and producer Jack Clement killed the project. Eggers hadn't paid the studio, so Clement erased the mastered tapes in anger. Eggers managed to smuggle out rough cassette mixes, and those lost songs would resurface decades later on the Nashville sessions. The incident was sort of emblematic of the frustrations Zandt faced in his career. Bad luck, bad management, and a music industry unsure of what to do with his melancholic brilliance. By 1975, he had decided to part ways with Eggers after years of rather shaky dealings. He entrusted his affairs to a new manager, John Lomax III, grandson of the famed folklorist John Lomax, who set up a fan club to harness the grassroots enthusiasm around Townes' music. Even with minimal advertising, Lomax was deluged by hundreds of impassioned letters from around the world, including fans who said Townes' songs had helped them through depression. Even during his private chaos in the 1970s, Townes reached some extraordinary artistic high watermarks. In 1973, he gave a series of intimate concerts at the Old Quarter, the tiny 60-seat club in Houston, where he had learned his craft years before. Those shows, performed solo with just an acoustic guitar, were luckily recorded to tape. 4 years later, they were released as live at the Old Quarter, Houston, Texas. A double live album that many fans and critics consider the quintessential Townes Van Zandt record. Free of any studio gloss, the album gives us Townes at his purest. You hear his gentle picking, his dry Texas drawl, introducing songs with off-kilter jokes, and then the pin-drop silence as he delivers masterpieces like Puncho and Lefty, If I Needed Ya, and Tecumseh Valley to an enraptured audience. Live at the Old Quarter also was given glowing reviews. Rolling Stone said that it was a haunting portrait of a songwriter at the peak of his powers. For once, Townes saw a glimpse of wider fame, but consistent with the pattern of his life, just as things seemed on the upswing professionally, his personal life was becoming a mess. In 1974, during one of his Houston residencies, 30-year-old Townes began dating a wild teenage girl named Cindy Morgan. She was just 15 when they met, though she lied about her age at first. Townes fell for her and eventually learned the uncomfortable truth, but by then he was in love. Their relationship was as impulsive and freewheeling as Townes' lifestyle, which is to say, it was often totally dysfunctional. They married in 1978, after Cindy had turned 18, but by then Townes' drinking was out of control and he was frequently absent on the road. The marriage crumbled fast. They separated within a couple of years and officially divorced in early 1983. During this same period, Van Zandt severed ties with his longtime friend and running buddy Guy Clark, and he cycled through managers and record deals. In fact, in 1978, displaying the same capricious streak that defined much of his life, Townes fired Lomax and rehired Kevin Eggers. That same year, he released what would be his last studio album for nearly a decade, Flying Shoes. The title track was a poetic meditation on mortality. Tellingly, Townes sings, "Day is done, gone the sun, nights are getting cold," in the opening line, as if foreshadowing the dark times ahead. For much of the late 70s, when not touring, Townes lived reclusively in a tin-roofed, bare-board shack outside of Nashville, with no heat or phone, preferring the company of his dogs, his guns, and his muse. One of those dogs, a half-wolf husky named Geraldine, became his most beloved companion. She even appears lounging at Van Zandt's feet in heart-worn highways. You might say she was a symbol of his untamed life. By this juncture, Van Zandt's addictions were catching up with him. He had begun drinking heavily in his 20s, whiskey for the most part, and by the mid-70s, he was seldom seen without a glass or bottle nearby. Drugs too had entered the picture. Friends recall him using heroin in those years, as well as pills and cocaine. The depths of his dependency were alarming. At one low point, Townes was so desperate for a fix that he offered his manager, Kevin Eggers, the publishing rights to all the songs on his first 4 albums in exchange for $20 cash, essentially trading away his life's work for a couple of hits of heroin. Eggers declined the offer and was horrified at how far his client had sunk. On at least one occasion, an intoxicated Townes shot up heroin in front of his young son, JT, who was only 8 years old. His growing legend as a songwriter went hand in hand with his legend as a drunk. Fellow musicians told tales of Townes mixing up wild cocktails. He'd inject vodka or even a rum and coke mixture into his veins when the mood struck. On stage, he might nod off or repeat songs twice. It was as if all the haunted characters in his songs, the lost souls waiting to die, were consuming him from within. Seeing that Townes needed full-time supervision, his associates took action. In 1976, Kevin Eggers' brother, Harold Eggers, became Townes' road manager and, in effect, caretaker. Harold was significantly younger than Townes, but for the next 20 years, he seldom left the singer's side. He later joked that Townes was his first child, so total was the care he had to provide. Harold drove Townes to gigs, kept him somewhat on schedule, and most importantly, tried to curb his substance use enough to keep him alive. This was an uphill battle. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, Townes cycled in and out of rehabilitation centres, nearly a dozen times by one count. He would sober up for a short spell, then relapse spectacularly. Doctors who evaluated him during these stints painted a tragic picture. By 1982, he was consuming at least a pint of vodka a day. He admits to hearing voices, mostly musical voices, one reported, and suffering from blunted emotions and impaired judgment. They prescribed medications, antidepressants like Zoloft, and mood stabilizers like lithium. But Townes rarely stuck to them. The tug of alcohol was too strong. In 1981, Emmylou Harris and Don Williams scored a top 3 country hit with If I Needed You, the tender love song Van Zandt had written years before and reportedly first sang to his pet parakeet in a cage, so the story goes. Then in 1983, country superstars Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard teamed up on a duet of Pancho and Lefty and took it all the way to #1 on the country charts. Suddenly, Townes Van Zandt's name was appearing in Billboard magazine, albeit as a songwriter, not a performer. The Willie and Merle version of Pancho and Lefty became a modern classic, and Van Zandt even had a cameo in their music video, looking bashful in the background. The song's success brought him a substantial royalty windfall. Ever the drifter, Townes promptly spent much of the money on a new truck, and likely a prodigious amount of liquor. Financial security remained as fleeting as a West Texas rainstorm. Though he wouldn't ever find the true spotlight himself, Townes was majorly influencing a new generation of songwriters during this time. The likes of John Prine, Nancy Griffith, Guy Clark, and younger artists such as Lucinda Williams and Jason Molina were either covering his songs or citing him as an inspiration. Novelist Larry McMurtry later wrote that in the 1980s, every hardcore folkie or country outsider in Texas kept a copy of the late great Townes Van Zandt on their turntable as a sort of badge of honor. Townes' mystique had an undeniable romantic appeal, but the reality of his life in the 80s was far from glamorous. One oft-told anecdote describes how Townes, who loved firearms, one day amused himself by shooting holes all through the floor of his own home to pass time. He also had a rather impish sense of mischief. He would show up unannounced at friends' homes at odd hours, or prank acquaintances, For instance, he once reportedly presented a lover with a dead fly or mouse as a gift, just to get a reaction. His dark humour could border on morbid. Such stories circulated in close-knit songwriting circles and only fed the myth of Townes, half holy fool, half genuine genius. Townes' messy love life continued as well. In December 1980, at a memorial event in Austin for John Lennon, Townes met a young woman named Janine Munsell. She was enthusiastic to say the least, a self-professed hardcore Townes fan 14 years his junior, and before long, they were inseparable. There was a hitch in their plans to get hitched, though. Townes was still technically married to Cindy, though they were now estranged. When Janine became pregnant with Townes' child in 1982, Townes' terminally ill mother insisted he do the right thing. So he finally divorced Cindy and married Janine in March 1983. Their son, William Vincent van Zandt, was born 10 days later. A daughter, Katie Bell, followed in 1992. Another shot at fatherhood, however, did not magically reform Townes. If anything, he spiraled further into dark places. By the mid-80s, Janine found herself essentially a single mother of two, one of them being her mercurial husband. She tried to help manage Townes' career, not always admirably, as later accounts have alleged she sometimes enabled his habits, or made self-interested decisions. In one controversial move around 1993, Janine persuaded Townes, who was by then deeply unwell, to sign over the rights to his song publishing and royalties to her and their kids. This left Townes with only live performance fees as income in his final years. Some friends felt Janine exploited Townes' condition for control of his catalogue. Others say that she did stand by him when few else would, and ensured that his children were provided for. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, much like Townes' own nature, which could be by turns loving and selfish, lucid and utterly lost. In 1986, a surprising thing happened. Bob Dylan wanted to find Townes Van Zandt. Dylan had been an early hero of Townes' back in 1965. Now, 2 decades on, Dylan was himself an admirer of Townes' work. According to songwriter Susanna Clarke, Guy Clarke's wife and a close friend to both men, Dylan repeatedly invited Van Zandt to co-write songs together. Townes characteristically turned him down. By this time he didn't, quote, care for Dylan's celebrity, and more likely felt intimidated by the prospect, though he respected Dylan's songwriting. In June 1986, the two finally met by chance on a street in Austin. Dylan ended up visiting Townes' motorhome, where he sat and listened as Van Zandt played a few songs for him privately. One can only imagine that scene. The multi-millionaire voice of a generation, sitting in a shabby RV, enthralled as Townes Van Zandt sang of Pancho and Lefty, Tecumseh Valley, or perhaps a then unheard gem. That meeting of mutual legends remained a little-known footnote at the time, but it tells us something important. If Bob Dylan, a Nobel Prize winner and arguably America's greatest songwriter, considered Townes Van Zandt a peer, it confirmed that what devoted fans already believed. Van Zandt's artistry was of the highest caliber, even if his life was a bloody mess. Nonetheless, Townes' creative output slowed to a crawl during the 1980s. In 1983, a small label reissued some old demo recordings under the title The Nashville Sessions, but there was no new material. Finally, in 1987, a full 9 years after Flying Shoes, Townes released a new studio album, At My Window. Now recording for Sugar Hill Records, he was 43 years old and noticeably changed. His voice had dropped into a lower, smokier register with a weathered edge, road-weary yet still pure in its own way. The album's songs like Snowin' on Raton and Buckskin Stallion Blues were reflective and autumnal. Critics greeted At My Window pretty warmly. Many were simply relieved to hear that Townes was alive and making music at all. The album didn't sell in huge numbers, but it at least re-established Townes as an active artist. He even made a handful of television appearances and bigger venue shows in the late 80s. A 1988 concert review in the New York Times marveled at Townes' ability to, as they wrote it, combine the quality of a Zen monk and a West Texas barfly in the same figure. On stage, he wore a suit jacket over his faded jeans, hair unkempt but eyes piercing as he delivered devastating ballads one moment and cornball jokes the next. The world was finally catching up to Townes Van Zandt, just as he was slipping away. In the 1990s, Townes Van Zandt gained a measure of late-life recognition, even as his physical and mental health continued to decline drastically. He was, as one friend put it, astonished to be alive. Many who knew him were also, frankly, rather surprised he had survived this long. The toll of decades of hard living was etched on him. His tall frame had turned gaunt. His face, once movie star handsome, was creased and ashen. Still, with the stubbornness that was his hallmark, Van Zandt kept performing and writing new songs. In 1990, he embarked on a 2-month tour, opening for the alternative country rock band Cowboy Junkies. This pairing introduced him to a younger audience who knew nothing of his history, but were blown away by his heart-wrenching songs each night. Townes befriended the band and even wrote a song in their honor, Cowboy Junkies Lament, which cleverly included a verse about each member. The Junkies, in turn, wrote a playful tribute to him called Townes Blues. The tour gave Van Zandt a taste of larger stages and professional touring conditions, quite a contrast to his usual solo nighttime drives across Texas. By all accounts, he loved it, though he found it ironic that after 25 years of dues paying, he was finally opening for a bunch of kids. His legend, though, was clearly on the rise. In 1993, the influential English magazine Mojo ran a major retrospective on his career. In 1994, No Depression magazine and the emerging Americana music press hailed him as a patriarch of the genre. Townes also spent more time overseas in the 90s, where audiences in Europe had long appreciated him. He recorded No Deeper Blue in 1994 at a studio in Ireland, his first album of new originals since At My Window. The album has a subdued elegiac feel. Songs like A Song For and The Whole confront mortality and loss head-on. On Marie, arguably his last great composition, he tells the harrowing story of a homeless couple with heartbreaking empathy. By now, Townes' voice sounded like it came not just from another time, but perhaps from beyond the grave. Fragile, cracked, yet still capable of unexpected tenderness. Reviewing No Deeper Blue, one critic wrote that Van Zandt's music seems to emanate from some perfect darkness, and that his cult might finally be poised to expand. Townes himself rather wryly remarked to a reporter around this time, "I've been in 6 or 7 mental hospitals and 10 or 12 alcohol hospitals." It was funny because it was true. The years of abuse had led to many hospitalizations. In 1994, one doctor warned Janine Van Zandt that subjecting Townes to detox again could kill him. His body simply couldn't handle the shock of sudden sobriety. And so, incredibly, he kept drinking in order to stay alive. By the mid-90s, those close to him observed that he had withered to a shadow of himself. Yet somehow, he pressed on, touring whenever he could, accompanied by his ever-loyal road manager, Harold Eggers. In 1996, a particularly dramatic chapter unfolded. Sonic Youth drummer Steve Shelley, a fan, offered to produce and release Townes' next album on a boutique label funded by Geffen Records. This was a tantalizing opportunity, a well-funded recording session that could potentially reintroduce Townes to a wider rock audience. Sonic Youth were massive at that time. Townes agreed, and sessions were scheduled for late December 1996 in Memphis. As the date approached, however, his self-destructive streak reared up one final time. On or around December 19, 1996, A very intoxicated Townes Van Zandt fell down a concrete staircase outside his home, badly breaking his hip. He lay outdoors for an hour before crawling back inside and calling Janine for help. When friends arrived, Townes, ever contrary, refused to go to the hospital. He insisted he was fine and claimed he'd merely stumbled getting out of bed. Instead of medical care, he opted to convalesce on a friend's couch, immobilized and in excruciating pain, sipping whiskey through Christmas. A week later, astonishingly, Townes was determined to keep his recording date. In the last week of December 1996, he had his friends drive him, wheelchair-bound, his hips still unset, from Nashville to the Memphis studio. The scene was grimly surreal. Townes was pale, incoherent, suffering enormously, and clearly in no shape to perform. Upon seeing his condition and drunkenness, Steve Shelley had no choice but to cancel the sessions. Only then did Townes relent to hospitalization. By the time doctors examined him on December 31st, they found he'd been walking, or crawling, around for 8 days with an impacted femoral neck fracture. Essentially a broken hip jammed out of position. They operated immediately, but now another problem loomed: detox. Janine had informed the surgeons that Townes' alcohol dependence was so severe that sudden withdrawal could be deadly. The medical team strongly urged keeping him in the hospital so they could manage his delirium tremens safely. Janine, however, was distrustful and decided to check him out of the hospital against medical advice on New Year's Eve. The doctors refused to give Townes any painkillers upon discharge, knowing he would drink and fearing an overdose. Sure enough, as soon as they reached the car, Janine handed Townes a flask of vodka to calm his shaking delirium. He became lucid after a few swigs, even cheerful as they arrived home in the Nashville suburb of Smyrna. At the house, they gave him more alcohol to stave off withdrawal, plus a few Tylenol PM pills for pain. Townes spent the final evening of 1996 calling up old friends in a surprisingly good mood, as if aware this might be farewell, and he was ready to make his exit. Just before midnight, as Janine spoke on the phone with Susanna Clark, their 13-year-old son Will noticed that Townes had gone quiet. He wasn't breathing. Janine dropped the phone and desperately tried CPR, screaming his name between breaths, but it was too late. Townes Van Zandt died in the early morning of January 1st, 1997, at the age of 52. The coroner listed his death as a natural cardiac arrhythmia, essentially heart failure. But it was plainly the cumulative result of decades of abuse and the chaotic circumstances of his injury and withdrawal. In a final poetic twist of fate, Townes left this world on New Year's Day, 44 years to the day after Hank Williams, the very legend he'd long been compared to, was found dead in the backseat of a Cadillac on New Year's Day, 1953. Townes often said Hank's music was in his DNA. He even wrote a song called Highway Kind that many interpret as a conversation with Hank's ghost. Now he joined his hero in an eternal folklore of country music tragedy. If Townes Van Zandt had slipped into relative obscurity during his final years, his legacy since 1997 has grown enormously. In death, the wider world began to discover the treasure trove of songs he'd written in life. A revival of interest in Van Zandt's music was already budding by the mid-90s, but it bloomed after his passing. Numerous albums of archival recordings, demos and live performances have been released posthumously, allowing fans to hear unreleased songs and raw versions. In 2019, an album of previously unheard 1973 recordings, titled Sky Blue, was issued on what would have been Townes' 75th birthday. The material was, as ever, stunning in its beautiful simplicity. Just Townes and his guitar, mid-strum, delivering songs as stark and lovely as anything in his official catalogue. Listening to these lost tapes, I can easily imagine Townes Van Zandt at 75 had he lived. The 2004 documentary film, Be Here to Love Me, directed by Margaret Brown, put together rare footage and interviews to paint a cinematic portrait of Townes' world, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As fellow songwriter Rodney Crowell observed, Townes could make you laugh at a funeral and cry at a birthday party. He transmuted his personal pain into something universal. Perhaps no one has been a louder champion of Van Zandt's legacy than Steve Earle, who once served as Townes' protege. Earle's hyperbolic proclamation, "Townes Van Zandt is the best songwriter in the whole world, and I'll stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in my cowboy boots and say that," is now legendary. When Townes heard this, he characteristically deadpanned in response, "I've met Bob Dylan's bodyguards, and if Steve Earle thinks he can stand on Bob's coffee table, he's sadly mistaken." John Cruth's 2007 biography, To Live's to Fly, gets deep into his chaotic life, far deeper than I can in an hour-long video. It's a great read and was a major source for my research. In it, Cruth is unearthing stories that sound like backwoods folklore, like the time Townes drunkenly fell out of a speeding pickup truck on the way to a gig with Lightning Hopkins, breaking his arm and blowing the opportunity. Or the time he set a pony on fire at a party. Yes, that actually happened. Miraculously, both pony and partygoers survived. Such was the bizarre world of Townes. Yet, unlike many mythic rock and roll casualties, Townes Van Zandt wasn't motivated by a desire for notoriety or excess for its own sake. If anything, he was profoundly uncomfortable with success and material stability. He once said, "There's a lot of money in songwriting. I made about $10 last year." Only half joking. He truly didn't care about money beyond what little he needed to get by and to keep his habits going. As long as he had a guitar and a receptive ear somewhere, Townes was at home. As the man himself once sang, "Days up and down they come, like rain on a conga drum. Forget most, remember some, but don't turn back. The road goes on forever." For Townes Van Zandt, the road has indeed gone on, carrying his voice into the future, where those who need it will find it, waiting around, refusing to die. Thanks for listening. I'll put a few links in the description to some of his finest songs, as well as the scene I mentioned from Heart-Worn Highway. Cheers and see you on the other side.